Welcome back to the Renaissance Woodworker. I'm your host, Shannon Rogers, and welcome back into my shop. I get questions all the time about my workbench, and I built this a couple years ago, and one of the biggest questions I get is, do you ever have issues with your row of dog holes being set so far back from the edge of the bench? When I built this, I knew that I wanted the dog holes rather, to run all the way along the end of the bench, and I didn't want to have to worry about spacing around the mortise and tenon joints where the legs come in. Certainly there are ways that you can drill right down into the mortise and put like a little relief hole down here that you can use to bump the dog back up. Honestly, I was feeling lazy and I just decided to lay the dog holes out back behind that mortise. So I think I'm about 5 inches, maybe about 6 inches back from the edge. And you know, I worked on it for about a year, and then someone asked me, is that a problem that your dog holes are set far back? And honestly, I never even thought about it until somebody asked me that. My first response was, what do you mean set too far back? And then I started looking around and realizing that a lot of people are lining up their row of dog holes 1 inch, 2 inches back from the edge. The thought being that when you work with a fenced plane, like a plow plane or a rabbet plane, the fence, as it rides up against a board, it can only go so deep before the fence bottoms out on the bench top itself, and it won't sink in any deeper. So you want to be able to line up your board so that the fence will ride off the edge. For that matter, if you can align the fence with the front edge of the bench, you've got even more of a square reference surface to work on. So I started to run into issues when I was working on thinner pieces. I've got these 3-inch wide style pieces that just won't fit in the dog hole. The dog row would lock them back here, and I need to lock them right up front. Well, there are ways to work around that, and honestly, I'm still very glad that the dog holes are where they are, because while people talk about the disadvantage of them being far back, one of the major advantages is that you can lock a workpiece, a wide piece, and this is an 11-inch wide board. This is a case side. You can lock a wide board like this firmly in the center of the board and have really good registration. And what I find is when I'm surfacing by hand, if I've got a joiner plane or a foreplane and I'm traversing across the board or working in a diagonal direction, I get excellent work holding power because I'm grasping in the middle of the work. If I'm trying to hold it, you know, right on the edge like this, there's a tendency for the board to want to shift in the clamps, and you're just not holding it as well. The more you try to increase the clamping pressure on the vise, the more trouble you're going to have in the long run. You're either going to dent your work, or it's going to end up shifting and kind of tearing out the end or whatever. So I really like being able to hold work back further from the edge. It's really useful if I'm ever doing any kind of chisel work and I want to hold the board back and maybe sit at the bench and work down from there. But as I said, the minute I bring a little piece like this to bear, I run into problems when I have to work with a fenced plane. Here's a quick solution I came up with. Doesn't require any work holding techniques, and it works like a charm. So if I want to work on a thinner piece like this, it's perfectly fine, but as soon as I want to bring in a fenced plane, I run into issues. Right now I've got enough clearance for the fence to ride along without bumping into the bench top. But I've got this plow plane set to plow a groove 1/4 inch deep. Probably a couple passes from now, my fence is going to bottom out and it's not going to cut anymore. I like to generally align my workpiece with the edge of my bench when I do any kind of fence cut like this, because it gives me even greater surface. And a lot of times these planes have little accessory holes on it that allow you to put a big wide fence. If you put a 6-inch wide fence on the side of this thing, it will reference really firmly and give you really very square holes. I can take something like a holdfast and I can drop it in and very easily hold this board from 2 different points. And that'll work fine for a while, but the same thing happens. While I'm riding high, I'm not interfering with the holdfasts, but as the plane begins to dig down into the groove, these posts over here are going to start bumping into these holdfasts, and it's going to cause problems. It's not going to allow me to sink it all the way. So it doesn't happen very often, but there are times when my current bench setup leaves me wanting for some clamping pressure. So flip this over. I've got just a couple of pieces of double stick tape on the back side. This is just Turner's tape. Just gotta get this backing off without pulling the tape off. Now I can align the edge of my piece with the edge of my bench. This is pressure sensitive stuff. A little bit of pressure, and now I can reference my plow plane work is held securely, and I can plow the groove with no problem at all. Even as the groove gets deeper, there's nothing in the way of the fence, the depth stop, the fence posts, or anything until the plane bottoms out on the depth stop and stops cutting. And then, just a little bit of pressure, and it pops off the bench. You can peel the tape off the back. This is not one of those things where you want to leave it adhered to your bench for a long time, because this glue, this tape rather, will get stickier and harder to remove the longer it's laid in there. So in essence, if you're building a workbench and maybe you can't afford a really high-end Invise, or you can't get a whole bunch of holdfasts or something, buy yourself a roll of double stick tape. It's all the work holding you're ever going to need. We'll see you next time, guys.